If you've been in a gaming circle long enough, you've no doubt heard the term artificial difficulty thrown around. It's one of the many examples of how gaming spaces become polarized around the concept of difficulty. Other ones could be calling a certain tactic cheese, considering a group of players to be playing the game wrong despite them being able to match the challenges set by the game pretty well, or perhaps finding grievance with the devs for balancing a multiplayer game around the noobs, the scrubs, the hoi polloi, making it not require skill anymore. Other YouTubers could say that's the result of the personal, subjective nature of the relationship between any individual gamer and the concept of difficulty. They could say that no combination of player preference, community consensus, and the level of challenge presented by a game are going to be better or worse objectively. Well, I consider those people cowards, and I will fight them. So let's delve into what I consider to be the objective hallmarks, the differentiators of good difficulty versus bad, and season that with a bit of observation on how player psychology of difficulty is a subjective and fickle beast, but one that doesn't ultimately escape description and categorization. First of all, I feel that the difference between good and bad difficulty seems to elude definition and classification at first, due to one single mistake that we often make. Well, not the two of us specifically, we smart, but, the other guys. And that mistake is not differentiating between difficulty as increasing the level or variety of challenge versus difficulty as increasing the likelihood of failure, or decreasing the likelihood of success, whichever you prefer. Those are not the same thing. It is also my first instinct to buckle against considering them different in any way, because they do seem similar at first glance, but bear with me here. So, the first one, challenge as the requirement of activation of higher intensity or wider variety of skill in order to win, or, if you prefer non-Moonman talk, the necessity to try harder or try something new on the player's part. It may be motivated by impending failure, among other things, and they are often conflated, but I will say it again, those are not the same thing, and this may be a bit of a hot take. But difficulty understood as presenting a challenge can be completely divorced from any sense of consequence. Let's consider an example of difficulties where you die in one hit. I would not say those are considerably more difficult than the lower difficulties. You are just less likely to be able to get away with ignoring the difficulty. But if the enemy's attack patterns stay the same, it doesn't matter for the level of challenge presented if the consequences of not reading those patterns correctly are instant death, or maybe the loss of a quarter of your HP. You either get good, don't get hit, and succeed, or you fail. Higher consequences of failure may present an added motivation not to fail, which is probably why players who enjoy a high level of challenge also enjoy that sort of thing, but that's not because they especially enjoy the motivating factor itself, I don't feel. They enjoy the state of heightened motivation to meet a challenge that it leads to, so they enjoy the ends and not necessarily the means. But because those two are enjoyed at a high intensity by the same player base, it leads to another conflation between the two. But you can absolutely have games that require a high level of skill but are permissive of you failing often. And that's also present in Devil May Cry, by the way, but on the lower difficulties mostly. You will no longer die as easily, but to get those coveted triple S ranks, you will need to be as good as on the higher tiers. You will just not be punished as strictly. Now, in a bit of advocatus diaboli, we could argue that dealing with the stress of catastrophic consequences of failure, like in Iron Man modes in many games, is a skill in of itself. Similarly with repetitious difficulty, like boss rush modes or making enemies bullet sponges and making every battle take ages. it could be argued that they cultivate the skills of staying concentrated for prolonged periods of time, a sort of mental fortitude. But I think that's a co. As having those skills above a total minimum is at best tertiary when it comes to a player's expected skill set in those games, you will not need much mental fortitude to play the game itself. You will not need that to be good at them apart from these specific modes. And this is a bit of a more personal, subjective note, but I feel that good one-shot difficulties and good boss rushes mostly stem from the gameplay itself being fun, and not from these concepts adding anything substantial. Now, for a bit of a different perspective, let us consider Beat Saber. Beat Saber is the hit VR rhythm game where, using handheld controllers, you're supposed to be slicing in appropriate direction through these approaching colored blocks to the rhythm of your favorite songs. Beat Saber has a very healthy modding scenes where creators, often called mappers, create new levels to the music of their favorite beats. Now, the requirements for being a good mapper are twofold. First, you have to create a level that fits the song to some extent. At least the majority of cuts should happen to the beat of the song. Patterns within the melody should be reflected in some way in the level design, and bonus points for making the player feel like they're dancing and not just flailing the arms around. But on the other hand, the mapper is also supposed to present an appropriate level of difficulty for a player of a particular level of skill. For example, for a player like me who plays on the expert difficulty, least impressive flex by the way, you can expect more or less general benchmarks in terms of speed, readability, and use of particular techniques to be met. Like these rapid-fire alternating slices, which I found myself panicking at a lot when I was newer to the game, but they are expected to be seen at an expert level if they fit the beat, of course. But a map can hit most of these technical benchmarks in an unfun way as well, like using some sort of cheap tricks, like these formulaic sequences that you have to get the first note on or you fail. Like, those are not considered to be a fun way to implement difficulty, at least not for me. And there are other techniques that will make the likelihood of failure higher, but will not make the song more challenging in a fun way as a result. Like particular types of sequence breaks, where you habituate the player to expect one sort of sequence, but then change it up at the last moment. These can be fun if done well, but I often find them to be a likely culprit for the unfun maps that I play. And just looking at how many people succeed and fail, like on a graph, for a fun, challenging song and an artificially difficult one of similar difficulty, is of course going to look similar, but player satisfaction is going to vary wildly. And once again, I believe the ultimate goal of implementing difficulty, especially higher difficulty, is player satisfaction, mostly through skill activation and the cultivation of those same skills, and not the likelihood of failure or success changing. That is a popular but ultimately unnecessary byproduct of introducing challenge. On the other hand, you can have unsuccessful attempts to make something fun despite meeting those quasi-objective technical challenge benchmarks. If your level is not musically appropriate, like if you include unnecessary extra cuts that don't fit the beat to make it more difficult, in a process often called overmapping, that's going to be unfun. It's not going to elicit enjoyment, even though it's technically sound in terms of the level of difficulty it presents, because that challenge is again not going to be in service of fun, which is moving to the music. The excellent BSMG wiki, which is chock full of great advice for prospective mappers, has this to say about adjusting difficulty during the mapping process. We say that a map has artificial difficulty if it includes elements that make it more difficult without enhancing any other aspect of the map, i.e. it does not play better or represent the music better. You should normally avoid artificial difficulty. Instead, consider whether your map can represent more of the song or whether you can up the intensity of the gameplay. So it's not just a matter of hitting those objective benchmarks, which could of course lead us to this fallacious idea that good difficulty and bad difficulty is fully subjective. But I believe it's kind of more akin to film or literary critique. Something can be a cheap trick or a fun hurdle in a person's eyes, but it being classified as such is not 100% subjective from person to person. It's based on meeting these objective benchmarks first, of addressing a particular level of skill intensity, and then on promoting a playstyle of fun. So these opinions can be very well justified. You can critique a mapmaker's choices in creating an appropriately difficult experience by the means of whether they correspond to what you think and the community thinks is appropriate to expect from a player of a particular skill level, whether their choice of elements to include shows an understanding of how the game is played at that level, and whether those inclusions create an experience that's more fun as a result. And the only subjective part is going to be what are the fun elements, and not how to get to them. Why is the game fun is not a difficulty question though, and we will not be tackling it in this video. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. This doesn't just apply to Beat Saber. Now, multiplayer games are an interesting variation on that concept, because it's less about the level of skill expected, because that's established by the competence of your competitors and not by developer choice. However, the game's creators have a lot to decide about which skills will be necessary, and to what extent. Let's consider Hearthstone Battlegrounds, a card-based auto-battler that generally rewards game knowledge, combo recognition, correct sequencing in terms of the cards you play, reading the field to see what kinds of builds your opponents are pursuing, as well as maybe calculating EVs if you want to be super technical. But there's also a number of builds, so-called APM builds, that utilize a different skill set entirely. Namely being able to make decisions and inputs, actions per minute, hence the name, very quickly. A fully set up late game pirate build is mostly only limited in its scaling potential by how fast you're able to play. Provided of course your decisions don't stray too far from the optimal, because if you brick yourself by doing something dumb, due to the sheer speed you're trying to play at, yeah, that's going to be bad. So if you're playing pirates, you can reasonably expect to outplay another player by being able to play faster than them. An extraneous or perhaps secondary skill for other Battlegrounds players. As you can imagine, that's led to APM builds being occasionally controversial, especially when they're strong, because playing fast is not a core skill for players not playing APM. Of course, all turns independently of your build are made on a timer, so you can't take 5 minutes every decision, but it's not a core competency unless you're playing pirates, maybe elementals or a spell build, at least on the current patch that's true. And those are a minority share of the metagame. So there is a skill that's important for a minority of players, but secondary or tertiary for the rest. And that's important because game fanbases sort of self-select in terms of the skills that they will view as cool and aspirational. Games, based on their initial presentation, will invite in players that respect and value particular skills. This may be due to them being more competent in terms of these, but doesn't have to be. They may just view those as ones they would like to possess. Mostly through online discussions, those players will create a sort of unspoken skill model of what should be expected from a player of a game like Hearthstone Battlegrounds. A model of skills they would like to use and see used by their opponents when a game is played. For example, dynamic shooters will invite in players that are enthusiastic about reaction time or quick reflexes, and they will view those skills as more aspirational over some others that will also be useful to some degree, like timekeeping or rote memorization. Now, of course, that is going to be context-specific because those other skills may be viewed as aspirational by the same players when it comes to other games, but they will expect to use a particular number of skills within that single game. And polarization of opinions around this skill model mostly happens when players perceive developers to be prioritizing and rewarding different skills than they prefer or the consensus chooses to value. This has been happening in League of Legends over its pretty much entire existence. I've been playing the game on and off since beta, and I can confirm that the game has shifted towards a more dynamic, movement ability focused, micro-intensive skill set. People often say that the game is worse as a result, at least worse than it was when the core skill set was more about positioning, global timings, and game knowledge. In an ideal world, that sentiment would be expressed along the lines of, I found the game more enjoyable when the most rewarded skill set was more in line with my preferences and/or abilities, but nobody talks like this. So instead we get game dead, everything has dashes and insta-gips, you know. But of course, developers aren't the only ones who get to decide which skills will be used to meet a challenge and how that decision will be viewed. And players, even in games that don't pit them against one another, often view methods of dealing with challenge along the lines of fair versus unfair, also called cheese. Cheese, an example of which you can see on screen right now, is a tactic that Reddit user SokiScribe loosely defined 4 years ago as exploiting some facet of a game or using an unreasonably strong strategy to make it easier. Here I'm using the doorway to the mini-boss room in a game called Lies of P to drop the boss's aggro, causing it to start retreating back into the room and giving me a larger than usual window to poke it with my weapon. And we can feel intuitively, I know I did as I applied this strategy, that this is not doing the boss fight properly. That my strategy is indeed exploitative of a facet of the game and/or unreasonably strong for the purposes of making the game easier for me. But what's interesting is that even though it's quite easy to grok, it's difficult to describe where effective strategy ends and cheese begins. The boss is also weak to fire damage, which my weapon utilizes. I am using that fact to my advantage also, to further reduce the amount of effort and probably skill that's necessary to beat the boss. And the difference between the two, between using the doorway strategy and using the elemental weakness of the enemy, cannot only be that one was intended and the other was not intended to be used by the developers, because Souls-like have seen their fair share of tools that were specifically put in the game by the devs to be used by the players, labeled as dishonorable or for scrubs. Like the Spirit Ashes mechanic in Elden Ring, which a small part of the player base has been entirely normal about. So the difference between using elemental weaknesses or Spirit Ashes and resetting enemy aggro, even though it's easy to discern when seen, gets more difficult to define, at least in a way that wouldn't also impact other discussions we may have around the concept of difficulty. If I were to speculate on a generalization here, I'd say that decisions that have a single point of failure, you either know the door trick or you don't, are viewed as less aspirational and more likely to be labeled cheese than decisions that still place you under constant tension or have multiple points of failure. For example, having to dodge or parry every single one of the boss's attacks. And yeah, there is powerful community consensus about this. If I were to post the video of me fighting the mini-boss on Instagram, I would probably get criticized for playing the game wrong. At least by the most audible part of the game's community. But I think that's a cope. There is no one objective optimum amount of effort involved in doing something the right way. There is no clear God-given guideline that makes reading the wiki less valuable of a skill than being able to press buttons fast in response to a stimulus. It's entirely subjective and community consensus-based that we view one as more valuable than the other. We've just decided that one's cooler. We intuitively feel that one takes more effort than the other, in that it's easier to read something on Reddit than establish the muscle memory necessary to dodge every attack, and we consider that measure of effort involved to be a feeler for skill. but it's a poor one, as the amount of effort actually involved, not just perceived, in playing the game the right way is going to vary wildly player to player. You'll get people for whom achieving the same level of mechanical competence is going to be much harder than average, or even nigh impossible. And allowing them to make up for that to some degree through use of clever tactics and understanding of secondary mechanics and even capital C cheese if need be, needn't bring concepts of propriety and honor into the mix. These players deserve to see success, and that success doesn't diminish anybody else's. On the flip side, I have little respect for the amount of effort required to learn to play the game the right way when easier ways are available. If someone finds joy in applying a higher than necessary amount of work to a problem, sure, more power to them, but I think we shouldn't entertain discussions of like work ethic and honorable behavior in the context of leisure activities, come on. I think it's a form of gatekeeping. It's a form of gatekeeping that we've been very permissive of in certain circles, especially in circles for difficult games, and I'm not super keen on that. Now, this next part is going to be a bit speculative on my part. It's based on my observations of communities that I'm a part of, and if you play different games than me and you've seen community consensi that are starkly different as a result, I would love to hear your opinions in the comments. That would be fascinating for me, so yeah, go ahead. Anyway, there are other indicators of which problem-solving tools and approaches are going to be viewed as more respected by the communities instead of just the amount of effort involved. First of all, based on my observations, styles of rising up to a challenge that require the utilization of mechanics and some sort of manual dexterity will often be presented as more aspirational than ones relying purely on player knowledge. At least in games where dexterity is expected to be a factor, like not Magic the Gathering probably. That's still partially connected to the effort thing, because it's easier or at least faster to read something on the wiki or read a deck guide than to commit something to muscle memory. There are also games where reactive playstyles will be viewed as more aspirational than proactive. Many games are structured in a way where the onus of showing higher skill is on the defending player. One example is fighting games like Tekken. At a low level, you can overwhelm opponents with sheer aggression. Just spamming your quickest safe move requires relatively little time spent learning as compared to being able to defend and counter effectively when met with that sort of relentless assault. Players who have played longer will have been able to cultivate that defensive skill, and they will climb to higher ranks as a result. That makes being able to play defense not only more effective at high ranks, but also emblematic of being part of that higher echelon of players. And that might very well be the other way around in other games. Based on my limited understanding of battle royale shooters, skilled players will often decide to jump into the fray more aggressively in the initial stages of the match, making that playstyle more emblematic of being good at those games. It's kind of a flex, in other words. A similar phenomenon is at play in some card games. Control will often be presented as a thinking man's archetype and contrasted with aggro. Control relies on matchup knowledge to a greater degree than aggro, of course depending on the format and the specific decks. Matchup knowledge is a skill that's aspirational for card game players, but due to its high effort cost and slow learning curve, you are unlikely to be able to learn matchup knowledge within a single day, for example. That skill is also emblematic of experienced players. Experienced players are often skilled, experienced players have matchup knowledge makes you skilled. In extreme enough situations, the opposite may be true. Many speedruns take a skill that's generally secondary and often overlooked to the point of dislike, like rote memorization, and use it to a degree that's so high that it becomes impressive again.
You must be fucking kidding me!
So to sum up my point, when comparing the right and wrong ways, quote-unquote of course, of rising up to a challenge, what's actually being compared is not how the method used to solve a problem reflects the amount of player skill, because Total skill is not a calculable metric. There is no SI unit for skill. What's actually being compared is how the method reflects the amount of effort, the aspirationality, and the emblematicity of being an experienced player, often because the learning curve of those skills makes them absent in beginner players and present among higher level ones. So those are the factors that lead gaming communities to decide that some ways of playing the game are better, more honorable, more skillful than others, even though the end result is often the same. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this was the difficulty video. Thanks a lot for joining me for this one. As always, it was a blast to make, and if you want to support the channel, I would appreciate a like, a sub, or a nice comment under this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.